Let me tell you about the most subversive passage in the Bible, John 13, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Now, there's nothing inherently transgressive about this passage. In fact, my interpretation might be more of what we would call a willful bastardization, reading between the lines to deconstruct the symbolic economy of the Bible. But I think that, like many things, the more you think about it, the more you realize that a lot can be said without actually having been said. When we look at John 13, we realize quickly how intimate this passage is. And it's rather short. It's basically just Jesus washes his disciples' feet and says, now go and do this to other people. You should have learned from this that just as I treated you, you should go treat others. So it's one of these classic stories of Jesus where Jesus teaches others to go out into the world with action and compassion and love, and that you should, have a spirit of giving. But there's so much more going on in this story. And eroticism is not something that we tend to associate with biblical passages. We might get it in chants, like the Song of Solomon, which is interesting in its own right. It's filled with sexual innuendo, but by and large, we don't assume that, for example, innuendo is a typical style of address in the Bible. We think about it being very, straight talking. Verily I say unto thee, it speaks past rhetorical subversion or muddying. It just speaks straight to the heart, right? But if we start to look at this passage, it's kind of like when you look at something strange in the world like clouds, and you imagine what would it be like to explain that to an alien race who's never seen clouds before. And you realize, this is a kind of weird thing. Like, it does this thing, and our water just kind of floats up in the sky in a different form, and it wafts by, and then sometimes it comes down, and we can kind of predict it, and we kind of can't. If we start to look at John 13 like that, and we start to think about this action of this prophet, and furthermore, if we're Trinitarians and, believers in the hypostatic union, which I'm not a Christian, but I just think that this is interesting to imagine oneself being a Christian and interpreting. Then Jesus is also the king of the universe. He's also, divine. So when we think about this figure washing his disciples' feet, already the idea of having disciples is kind of interesting because it creates this economy where you acknowledge the greaterness of this person up here, Jesus, and you're supposed to give your devotion and whatnot to him. So already this act of Jesus doing something for his disciples is turning that economy on its head. It's saying, no, that I as a leader lead by giving, not by receiving. This is not about siphoning up to the top, but it is about disseminating downwards into the margins. And the margins is important for this story because the disciples are marginal figures. I mean, in their societies, they are not royalty, they are not the crème de la crème, they are fishermen, they are carpenters and wanderers and vagrants of various kinds, and they are grafted into this, community that is created in such an interesting way that we can see is being subverted. And one of the things that I want to think about in this story is this symbolic economy of what's going on here, right? Because we have symbols, and a symbol is just anything that can stand for something else. But specifically, symbols often act as tropes. A good example would be the heart, right? The heart is a trope for feeling or emotion, right? If I say, oh, I just felt in my heart that I needed to do something. Obviously, I'm not literally talking about my heart. I'm using the heart as a symbol for emotion and feeling and attunedness, and I'm using in the mode of a trope. So when we start to think about this story through that lens, and we start to think about what are the ways that each of the symbols function here, and in particular, what is acting as a symbol that we don't realize is, or, what could be acting as a symbol, or could be interpreted as a symbol, even if there's no direction by the story for us to read it symbolically, because this is the great, interpretive leeway we have when we come to texts, is there's nothing to tell us 100% that something is a symbol, and therefore there is nothing to tell us 100% that something is not a symbol. So there's a whole range of literalist to, sort of metaphoricalist readings that we can adopt depending on what our interpretive goals are. And here my interpretive goal is just to see how much can we wring out of this rag, of this story, because we are like filthy rags to God, so let's make the text like a filthy rag for us and see what we can take out of it. And we see that the feet here are really symbols of the marginalized status of the disciples, right? In the erotic economy, the symbolic economy of eroticism, this is kind of weird to think about because feet aren't really even involved here. If we are looking at the Song of Solomon, for example, the vagina is symbolized by a lock, right, to symbolize chastity and purity, and the man is coming to use his key to open the lock. So this is a symbolic trope that is working here to enforce certain norms, right, about purity and when is sex proper and whatnot, and what does the actual act of consummation look like, what is its value and its purpose. And when we look at all these different possible symbols that could be used for the genitals, for example, well, we realize that the genitals are the center of this symbolic erotic economy, right? If we're trying to write a story and trying to write in innuendos about the genitals, we realize that the genitals are our focus. The feet are not something, however, that we usually assume is part of this sexual symbolic economy. In fact, they are sort of, marginal accretions. They are contingent, inconsequential accretions upon the libidinous locus of the genitals. And really, this is a Derridian point that, everything is a contingent, inconsequential accretion, right? Everything is happenstance and is accrued value after the fact in accordance with the system that it creates as it, sort of collates itself into symbols, and these symbols start to create differential values between each other. We get this idea through tradition, for example, that we know that the genitals are something that are super important and something to be protected for their purity, but you also don't talk about them. So there are all sorts of rules and whatnot associated with these different symbols that accrete over time. So what's really interesting here is that Jesus' act of worshiping this part of the body through the act of purifying it is the opposite of exclusionary. It is including a part of the body as relevant to the economy of eroticism that we usually don't think is. And therefore he's doing this sort of egalitarian erotic gesture here, which I think is really interesting. But more than just a valuative gesture, more than just bringing the feet into this symbolic economy, feet worship here becomes an erotic procedure and a ritual, right? This becomes a routine that is given unique symbolic status to actually raise feet to a uniquely valuable entity. At least in the act of being ritualized, they are uniquely valuable above the genitals as a unique site, a unique locus of libidinous energy. And not even in the language do we get any of this in John 13. Like I said, it's a pretty simple passage, but if you start to read this bodily encounter, which is what it is a bodily encounter between two people, in a sort of innuendo-like way, we realize that there is so much potential here for what is left unsaid. Because this is love, right? This is Jesus loving his disciples, his companions, his fellow men in a properly sexual way. Because what is sexuality? Well, it is an act of bodily union between two people that produces pleasure and ceases upon the act's fulfillment at climax. And what's going on here in John 13? Well, a bodily act of union, but between more than two people. So really, this is an orgy in a very interesting symbolic way. And it produces pleasure. What is this pleasure? Well, it is the pleasure of cleanliness and also the pleasure of being loved, of this gesture from someone else. Right? So this is a very deep sense of what is the value of sexuality. Well, it's beyond just the mere bodily. It's also the affective dimension that goes along with appreciating this bodily contact with someone else. And it ceases upon the fulfillment of climax, which is becoming clean, right? Being seen as clean enough for the act to cease, which is really interesting because when we think about what concludes climax, it's usually not cleanliness, but dirtiness. So in fact, there's something liberating and affirming about John 13, that eroticism is a type of purity of its own, that it's not something we should be ashamed of, but that it is a part that even the God of the universe wants to do with people, that even God is obsessed with sex, right? So like I said, that this is an orgy, but one of the other interesting things is that this passage seems to suggest that sexuality is an end in itself. When we tend to think about, and even when the Bible tends to think and talk about sex, it is about the end which results, which is the creation of progeny, right? Sex is supposed to be for procreation at best. It is not supposed to be for pleasure. Read any of Paul's letters, and you see quite clearly that, sex is a mark of the body, and we are essentially spirit and should, not be weighed down by the body. We should be trying to accrue more members of the faith, and we should be trying to, do our spiritual duties. And at best, we should get married so that we only have sex with one person, so that we are not, fornicating. So there's all this kind of prohibition around sex in the Bible, and yet John 13 seems to give us the reverse, saying that it is something not only natural, but purifying in itself, that it is an end in itself. And we consider that the thing that is being enacted throughout, the very means of pleasure, which is becoming clean, the act of being cleaned, is also that which confirms climax, right? Oh, I'm clean enough. You are clean enough. We stop this. So both the process and the end are the same. It is all about this performative action that Jesus is doing here. So this is an affirmation of sex as bodily nourishment, whose source is both marginal, the feet, other, coming from Jesus, and always already internal. The purity was always already in you. Otherwise, how could it have arisen by something other, the dirt being scraped off of you? So there's a beautiful rhetorical brilliance in this passage, since like the Song of Solomon or, Adam and Eve's implied acts in the Garden of Eden, it is eroticism in plain sight. It is at once covert, secret, and unspoken. And like I said, I'm sort of speaking it into the passage. It doesn't really exist in an important sense. And at the same time, it is essential. It is the most natural conclusion. In fact, an altogether likely implication. Who's to say that Simon Peter, Matthew, maybe even Judas didn't bust a load by the God of the universe attending to them bodily, right? Finally, and this is an interesting thing, John 13 affirms the eroticism of the word. For Jesus is the word, right? The logos. As such, the word here hits you bodily in the margins and in the center at the same time and commands you to explode with love for others. Right? It is a compulsion from without and an impulsion from within that makes us orgasmically confront communion with other people. A veritable sexual revolution. And really all centered around feet play, feet worship. It's so weird. It's comparable to a passage from the talking asshole scene from William Burroughs' Naked Lunch. This ass talk had a sort of gut frequency. Hit you right down there like you gotta go. Supplement ass with feet here, and you've got a rather apt description of the disciples' impending feeling of having to go. Go bust and go spread the word. So in a really interesting way, this is sort of demanding that we erotically paint the world. And I think that is really beautiful. And I think this is just kind of an interesting exercise, for those who are saying, you have totally misread this passage. In fact, you have bastardized and sullied and, heresied this passage. Good. I would say that every reading is an affront of its own, a violent gesture of its own, insofar as it must make the text something different. It must make it into a new language in an attempt to understand it. And this newness will always be demanded by the text, which demands that it is always more than it appears to be. So if we take text seriously as a site of encounter and a site of multitudinous, ambiguous implications, we allow the text to speak to us in very unique ways. And I think you will agree that this is a rather unique take on John 13. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it allows me to get the books necessary to provide content for y'all. It means a lot anytime anyone donates, but no pressure. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.